Thank you, Mike, for that beautiful prayer laced with all sorts of Ignatian nuggets, which I appreciate. I was signing books before, just walking around, and people would endlessly say, "Oh, I heard you speak here, and I heard you speak there." It happens. I remember once I was invited to speak to a gathering of foster grandparents in Orange County, a huge gathering from the whole state, but it was always held in Orange County. And I had spoken at it one summer, and then the next summer they asked me to speak again, and I thought, well, I just did it last summer, but oh well. And afterwards, the second time I did it, this foster grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked the talk. She had big tears in her eyes, and she grabbed both my hands, and she said, "I heard you last year." It never gets better. So, kind of hoping she misspoke there, but not entirely sure. Well, I'm really privileged to be here with you. Sorry I didn't bring homies, because I would just spent a whole week in Boston with two homies, and I continued on to DC, and I'm going to go to Twin Cities and Albuquerque, but so it was too much to have them for 2 weeks. I didn't want to take them away from their kids, so I sent them home. Well, here's what I think. You come to a thing like this, into a beautiful church like this, and an event like this reminds me of what Martin Luther King used to say about church. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you will eventually, when this evening is over, you're going to go from here and to do something very specific. You're going to try and roll up your sleeves and put one loving foot in front of the next to nurture into being a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. You're going to go from this church to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You will leave here tonight, and you're going to try to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And in order to do all those things, you have to stand at the margins, because that's the only way they'll ever get erased, is if you stand out at them. And you stand with a kind of particularity. You stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. This is what Catholic Charities does in this state and in your community. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, wow, what a privilege, you get to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And everybody in this room, I already know this about you, you know that you will need to brace yourselves when you go to the margins, because people will accuse you of wasting your time there. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And you will go from here, and other voices will get heard because of you." Well, actually none of that makes any damn sense unless we're really anchored in a God that's quite large. As St. Ignatius of Loyola says, the God who's always greater. So we don't want to settle for a partial God. We want to hold out for a spacious and an expansive God. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and a mystic, used to say, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." We only half believe that, which is part of the problem. We think God is somehow have other things on God's mind. I remember many years ago I had a spiritual director, and he said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit, but of course he's right, because we've settled for puny, and we should really hold out. Otherwise, we're just projecting onto God our own stuff. My friend Anne Lamott says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. We might need to avoid that at all costs. Which reminds me that Richard Rohr always says, it's true enough that we are created in the image and likeness of God, but it's equally true that our image of God creates us. So if we're aware of that, we can catch ourselves so that we don't fall into this trap. I remember, for 40 years I've been walking with gang members, and for 40 years I've been, celebrating the Eucharist in all the many detention facilities we have in Los Angeles County, jails and juvenile halls. We have 3 of those, and probation detention facilities, probation camps, they call them. Youth authorities, what we used to have. So on a rotating basis, I would say mass in all these places. And I was in San Fernando Juvenile Hall one Sunday, and it was, it's a gym with like 200 gang members there and folded chairs. And I was sitting up on a little raised platform. And I had my alb on and my stole, and I was sitting in the chair, and then the ambo over here the homies came up to do the readings one at a time. And they had these sheets that had the readings in English and in Spanish, so you could follow along. And when you preside, sometimes you close your eyes, you go, I'm just gonna listen to the readings being proclaimed. So I put the sheet on my lap, and I just listened. And the first guy got up and read from the Hebrew Bible, and then the responsorial psalm guy got up. And I don't know, there was like an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And I'm closing my eyes, and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because, the exalted God is our own creation, because every single one of us in this church, if we were God, let's face it, you would want to be exalted. But the exhausted God is closer to it. I met somebody before who was actually from California, and I said, "What are you doing here?" "Keeping up with my grandchildren," and I thought, well, that's it. It's like if somebody talked to you on a Monday and said, "How was your weekend?" "Oh my God, I'm pooped." I had the grandkids the whole weekend. It's a good tired, though. You know what that means. So it's it's about generativity. It's about being occupied with people who are outside of yourself. And that is closer to the God that we want to believe in, the God who loves us without measure and without regret. I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and one of the great gifts of COVID was that, was the invention of Zoom. And so we used to get together during COVID because we couldn't see each other. And now we still do it, which is great. And so we met, and not that long ago, and it was my mom's, would have been her 100th birthday. So we were all commenting on that. She died when she was 92, My father died, 30 years ago. And my mom died the way, you want to die, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids. And she was sharp as a tack, even till the very end. And in fact, in that last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a month before she died, she said to me, she was just giddy. She was just exhilarated. She goes, "Oh my gosh, I've never done this before." Which is something you say exactly before skydiving. And in fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed. She was asleep in the middle of the day. Very strange, because there were always many people in her room, and it was just the two of us. And she opened her eyes, and she saw me sitting there. And she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed that she hadn't died yet, and I'm sorry. And the next day, as luck would have it, I was there. It was exactly at noon. I think a couple of my sisters went out to retrieve some lunch or something. And she was asleep. And at exactly noon, she lifted her head from the pillow. She opened her eyes, and she let out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I remember in the last days of her life, there'd be 2 or 4, or all 8 of her kids, or a bunch of grandkids surrounding her bed. And she'd be in and out of consciousness. But when she would come to, she would lock on to just one of us, and with a laser beam focus. And she would say with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And I remembered that when we buried her, I thought, that may well be the singular agenda of our exhausted God, is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." In fact, I think we get these things kind of muddled, because we have this notion of Jesus in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, which is the precursor of our Lent. And I can never say the word Lent without telling you about Michelle Nunez, who worked at Homeboy, a homegirl, tough cookie from the projects. And she came into my office one day. She goes, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry." "I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent." No, that doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about, but but I'm kind of like Pavlov's dog. If I hear myself say the word Lent, I have to tell you about Michelle Nunez. But I digress. So there's Jesus in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, and we have this notion, agony, doubt, grumbling stomach, dark night of the soul. Those are all the things we have. When I suspect it was probably 40 days and 40 nights of God just looking at this guy and saying, "You're here. You're here." And so we receive the tender glance so that we can be that tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God so that we can be that notice in the world. We choose to be at the margins, to be who God is, compassionate, loving, and kind. In a lot of my books, I mention who I call my spiritual director, this homie named Sergio. Every morning, We're both up very early, so like 2:45 in the morning or 3, and we read the readings for the day, and then we send reflections to each other. Not long, today I sent, a paragraph maybe. And he signed off the other day an email, and he said, "So today I will surrender into the arms of God, then choose to be those arms." Pretty good. And that's what we hope to do. We want to choose to be those arms. I had a homie break down, sob in my office, because I think the whole weight of his life just kind of rushed in on him unexpectedly. So I let him cry. And then he looked at me through his tears, he could barely speak, and he said, "Has God disowned me?" And he proceeded to cry all the more. And when he could speak again, he looked at me and he says, "Have you?" And I realized in that moment that the only way he'll know that this is not on God's mind is to know that it's not on mine either. So, Homeboy Industries was born a long time ago, during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in Los Angeles, Dolores Mission Church, and it was nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. They comprise the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is not typical of public housing. Usually you have 1. So we had 8. And the LAPD called my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. We have 1,100 gangs in LA County, 120,000 gang members. I buried my first young person killed because of the sadness in 1988. And 3 months ago, I buried my 263rd. Not all from that parish, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked. So first thing we did was we started a school, because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had gotten the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were selling drugs, writing on walls. They were violent. So I walked out to them, and I would kind of isolate them one at a time. I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one said, "Yeah, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So across the street from the church is our parochial school, Dolores Mission Elementary School, and grades K to 8 occupied the first 2 floors of this 3-story concrete block building. And the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so one evening I gathered the nuns in their living room. I sat them down, there were about 8 of them, and I sat them down and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they looked at each other and they said, "Sure." And that was the entirety of their discernment process. And then we're off and running. And as it turned out, gang members from every single one of the 8 gangs showed up, which that's the good news. The bad news was we had big old brawls, 3 of them a day easily. So I'd have to run from the offices across the street to kind of quell this. The teachers didn't last very long. Once I had a principal who lasted exactly 1 day. I called him the next morning to try to find out where the hell he was, and he had changed his number and and apparently had checked into a witness protection program. But they came, which was so remarkable, and it created something of a disconnect in my parish, because people would sidle up to me and say, "Wait a minute, church is supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out, and which presented a good gospel challenge. And then they kept saying, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, and so the profile of folks who live at least in LA, in public housing, are women with children. There weren't a lot of men. So myself and the women, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that was not so forthcoming. So we just had to start stuff. We started a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of members of the rival 8 gangs. And then in 1992, the last day of April, after the acquittal of the 4 police officers who beat down Rodney King, every pocket of poverty just ignited in Los Angeles, except the poorest pocket, my parish. So the LA Times wanted to know, well, why was that? And so they asked me, and I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but we do have 60 strategically hired rival gang members who have a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. And so the next day the article appeared. Well, the following day I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he said, how should I spend my money? As I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, I had hair. And I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from the school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. And, I don't know, we could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members, and they could bake bread, and we could call it, Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. And so then we were off and running again. And then a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. And once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future, which we had previously called ourselves, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. So nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we evolved over the years into now becoming the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. We never intended to do that. So 10,000 folks a year walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. They come from prison, they come from the streets. They hope for a place where they can be safe, and then seen, and then cherished. They walk through the doors there. Every single one who comes to our place is barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one comes with what psychologists might call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Every single one walks through those doors, and they're greeted by people whose whole being says, "You're here. You're here." And so, if it's true that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, then it has to be equally true that a cherished person will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. And that's kind of the key. And so, 18-month program is kind of our centerpiece. Every homie wants to get in that because it's a paid gig. And then we have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet removes more tattoos than we do. Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. 3 laser machines. So if anyone is starting to regret that Catholic Charities tattoo you have, you know who I'm talking about. And so we have everything, anger management and classes and therapy, and we have 14 social enterprises, from dog grooming, which is our more recent one, which we call Puppy Fades. And we have a bakery, cafe, and lots of restaurants, electronic recycling. At Homeboy, we're allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up, mainly because our exhausted God never does that with us. Why would we do it with others? Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch them inhabit that truth. You watch them become that truth. And no bullet can pierce it, and no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. In the old days, in the projects, I would ride my beach cruiser in the middle of the night, and I would patrol all 8 gang territories, every night. And I remember this one gang, there was a kid named Danny, and Danny was just 13 years old when I met him. And whenever he was kicking it there with his homies, he always made a point to kind of lift his shirt to reveal that he had a gun tucked into the front for some reason. And he made a solemn vow to me once. He said, I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries. I go, And in gang recovery, like drug and alcohol, you always say it takes what it takes. In gang recovery, it's, the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he I had only known him inside juvenile hall and jails, and then he finally goes to prison for 2 years, and at 18. And he comes out when he's 20, and it takes what it takes to discover that his mother had 6 months to live as she had pancreatic cancer. So he had a lot of siblings, but remarkably, he was this very tender hospice caregiver. And he was just magnificently tender with her, which was all the more remarkable because she was kind of torturous towards him. And so I would see him there with her, and at one point I anointed her, and then a week later she died, and a week after that I buried her. And a week after that, Danny for the first time walks into Homeboy Industries. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is. I watch him work side by side with guys I know he used to shoot at, because I remember. And I watch him, as we say at Homeboy, laugh from the stomach. And he gets his GED, and he's doing well. And so one day he comes into my office, and he begins very dramatically. He says, "What happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life." And he proceeds to tell me that after work at 5, he goes to the train across the street from us at the Chinatown stop to take it east to go home. And he says the train was packed, but he managed to get a seat. And he said there was a guy hanging onto a pole standing right in front of him. And he goes, he was medio pedo, which means he was a little bit drunk. And he knew he was a homie, but he was an older vato, and he had tattoos on his hand. He didn't know him. And Danny is wearing a sweatshirt that says, "Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails." And the little bit drunk guy hanging onto the pole sees the sweatshirt. He goes, "Hey, you work there?" And Danny doesn't know whether to actually fully engage this guy. He just kind of nods. And the guy said, "Is it any good?" And Danny kind of shrugs. He says, "Well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place. And then Danny stands up and he reaches into his pocket, he fishes out a pen and he has a piece of paper and he writes very carefully the address of Homeboy Industries. As he's telling me this story, he goes, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart. And he finishes it up and he hands it to the guy. And he sees this guy. And he says, you come see us. We'll help you. And the guy studies the piece of paper. And he sees Danny. And he says, thank you. And the train stops and the guy gets off. And then Danny sits down. Now he returns to that earlier refrain. And he says, what happened to me next has never happened to me in my whole life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. Tender glance. You notice the notice of God, then you become that notice. And then suddenly you've obliterated the illusion that we are separate, that there is a us and a them. And this, of course, is God's dream come true, that you may be one. And you have to reach in sometimes, and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. Parentheses, I'm a Jesuit, and the homies don't know what a Jesuit is, really, so we have 500 homies and homegirls who work there, and then another 300 who are what we call core, we're all homies. 100 are core, and then 200 are senior staff. 70% of our senior staff are homies, so they run the place. But they don't know what a Jesuit is, even though we have 3 who work there. And my office, if you've ever been there, it's a glass enclosed, so I can look out, I can see the front door, who's coming in, and I can see the reception area, who's sitting there waiting for something to happen. And so we have, like 8 tour groups a day, people from all over the world and all over the country, and large and small. And I was sitting behind my desk one morning, and I had 2 homies in front of the desk, and I'm talking to them, and this group of like 20 just plants themselves in front of my glass office. And it's one of those, observe our founder in his natural habitat. And I wave faintly. And the guy giving the tour is Osvaldo, who the homies would say has a loud-ass voice. And he's going on and on. This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest. So from my desk, I start to do some of my, I think you'll agree, more impressive moves. Anyway, I told you that to tell you this, that on February 28th, 1540, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, enters this one word in his spiritual diary, his journal, and proceeds to use it a lot in the remaining 12 years of his life. And before he dies, he goes back and he circles the word for all the times he's used it. And I know Spanish, but I didn't know this word. And the word is acatamiento. Acatamiento. And it comes from kind of an archaic word, acatar, which means to look at something with attention. And it gets translated as affectionate awe. And though certainly it was born of this relationship between God and Ignatius, I'd like to think that he wanted it to be kind of more spacious and available, that it was really a disposition. What is to be our disposition when you go from this place out to the margins? What is your stance at the margins? And I'd like to think he's suggesting acatamiento, affectionate awe. Which reminds me in the Acts of the Apostles, where it has this one line, and it says, and awe came upon everyone. And it seems to suggest that the measure of health in any community, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Acatamiento. So many years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was what we used to call in those days gang in-service. So we used to have a lot of those all over the country. And so 600 social workers would commandeer a hotel ballroom, and they sign in and they get credits, and they have keynotes and breakout sessions and workshops. And to kind of learn, that no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang in the history of the world. And no kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something. So it kind of helps you talk about what should we be addressing? How do we infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign? How do we help heal the traumatized? How do we deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way? How do we acknowledge that gang violence is really about a lethal absence of hope? So I'd done a lot of these things. I figured I'd give a keynote. I said yes, and I bought my ticket to Richmond, Virginia. As often happens, like a week before I was to fly, I pulled out the letter that originally invited me, and to my horror, I discovered that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself what the homies often say, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. And so I quickly call in two trainees, homies, enemies, African-American gang member Andre and his enemy, Jose. And I sit them down, and they're both like in their 9th month in our 18-month program. And I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I would like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories before, and Jose got up first. And I think he was like 25 years old then. And, he shot caller, gang member, streets, tattooed, went to prison. So everybody's moving around in the 18-month program. They'll work at dog grooming, or they'll go over to work in the tattoo removal. He kind of glommed onto the substance use disorder team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only was he shot caller, gang member, prisoner, felon, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers. I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. But then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to this orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, "I found this kid." And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine, and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. The kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And this church and this place and this talk is not the place you've come to. It was always going to be the place you go from. And you go from here to put first things recognizably first, which is to say, to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. There are only 4 things. They're big, but it's only 4. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. When St. Francis of Assisi talks about the marrow of the gospel, that's what he's talking about. So let me bring this home. It occurs, especially in jiu-jitsu universities or high schools, to force their students to read my books against their will. And I'm not complaining, but Gonzaga University in Spokane, my alma mater, who ruins my bracket every March, forced the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart, and they were going to have a Tuesday night, a huge arena with 1,000 people. and they said, could you come and could you bring 2 homies with you? And I always, if people ask for homies, I bring them. I always pick homies in the same way. I always try to pick enemies, rivals, just so that they will share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of watching gang members panic in the sky. I was at LAX, and these were older guys, and one of them said, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Larry, an African-American gang member, and Mario, and his enemy. And recently I was telling, I just had 2 homies, and we went to Boston, and I've had so many trips, and homegirls, and couples, and and so I'm used to nervous Nellies, but this guy, Mario, I've never in my life, he was so terrified, and it was starting to freak me out a little bit, because he was hyperventilating, which I had never witnessed, like that. And we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. And so we were at Burbank Airport, which is a smallish airport, but they have big Southwest Airlines planes, and you don't board the plane through that hermetically sealed chute, but you walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and there are the steps that lead to the front of the plane. Big feature at Burbank is that they have steps that lead to the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry is exploring the airport. And it's early morning, it's still kind of dark, but it's the first flight of the day. And I see our flight crew arrives, and there are 2 female flight attendants, and both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the steps to board the plane. And just then, Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that Mario, in our 37-year history as an organization, is the most tattooed individual who has ever worked there, which is really saying something. He's all sleeved out, as we call it, all to his fingertips tattoos. Neck blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered in tattoos. Forehead, cheeks, chin. Eyelids that say the end, so that apparently when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And so I thought, well, let me walk him through the airport, calm him down maybe. And I'd never been in public with him. And so I was walking through the airport, and people are going, oh my God. And mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I think, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody who works there and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? Everybody would think for one beat, and then they'd say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that the highest form of spirituality is tenderness. He's proof that the only non-delusional response to everything is kindness. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's the Big Talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is all Tuesday during the day, They would like you to visit 93 classrooms. Like, oh my God, just tell them to come to the talk tonight. But oh well. So we did. And I told these guys, you get up and talk. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. Well, they told their stories. Mario was nervous. But stories of terror and torture and abuse of every imaginable kind and violence. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So we get to the arena, and there's 1,000 people, and I coax them to get up before me to tell their stories just as they had in the classrooms. And they did a good job. Mario was terrified. And then I got up and did my thing. And then I invited them to stand on either side of me, for the Q&A time. And yes, ma'am. So a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate is for Mario. And Mario's a skinny, tall drink of water, and he comes and stands in front of the microphone, and he clutches it intensely, and he's just terrified, and he says, yes. And the woman says, well, Mario, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes. He clutches the microphone with great intensity. He's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears. But he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. But trust me, everybody standing and clapping had been returned to themselves. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. Once you know, my friend Mirabai Starr says this, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. And that's an important task in mature spirituality. You receive the tender glance, and then you become that tender glance, and you recognize that God can't take God's eyes off of you. And because this God looks at you with breathless delight and says, you're here, we must do the same. And so today we surrender into the arms of God and then choose to be those arms in the world. In this talk, was never going to be just the place you came to, but it was always going to be the place you go from. In the same way that Catholic Charities does this for you in your community and in this state. You go from here to take seriously what Jesus took seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. You go from here to imagine a circle of compassion and then actively imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And so you decide to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And that's what the marrow of the gospel is about. And my sense from all of you already is that you gave up a long time ago caring if anybody accuses you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.